Welcome, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Tracy Cooper. I'm a member of the Board of Directors for Save Venice and also a member of the Projects Committee and Educational Resources Committee. I'd like to thank all of our webinar attendees for joining us today and extend a special thank you to those of you who are Save Venice members and invite those of you who are not yet to join us as well, as I think you'll see from today's presentation, how many wonderful events and how much there is to enjoy as a member. The contributions of our members help us to preserve the artistic heritage of Venice, and this includes the work of scholars like today's speaker, Dr. Nora Gietz, which is a fortuitous connection between her research and the kind of support that we've had from our members for different projects, as her work on today's topic was born from doing some research on the Church of San Marziale for Save Venice last year, one of the ways in which many scholars participate as well. And other works from the Church of San Marziale, including works by the female artist Julia Lama, are currently under treatment thanks to the generous donations of members of Save Venice, and work on some of this will be presented at the Renaissance Society of America conference in Dublin next week. The conference focuses with 2 sessions and multiple speakers on Save Venice's new Women Artists of Venice program, for which I'm proud to head the research track, the conservation track, headed by the director of the Save Venice office, Melissa Kahn. I would like to introduce Nora, who I'm happy to know from time together in Venice. And she is an art historian and historian working predominantly on the revolutionary and Napoleonic period in Venetian history. She is particularly interested in how the political and cultural watershed after the fall of the Venetian Republic, 1797, affected the city's artistic and architectural patrimony as a consequence of the widespread dissolutions of religious institutions. She completed her undergraduate studies in modern history at the University of Oxford before moving to the University of Warwick's art history department for her master's and doctorate. She contributed to Save Venice's celebrations of the 500th anniversary of Tintoretto's birth, with entries for Tintoretto in Venice, a guide, and that is edited by Thomas Della Costa, Robert Eccles, and Frederick Ilchman, our own leader. She wrote the chapter Lingering Glory and the Fall of the Republic for the recent and extended exhibition Venezia 1600, Birth and Rebirth, which is at the Palazzo Ducale in Venice. And for that catalog, edited by also Robert Eccles, Frederick Ilchman, Gabriele Mattino, and Andrea Bellini, will close on a significant date that we'll hear more about from Nora on the 25th of March. So unfortunately, you must get there quite quickly. Let me also remind attendees, if you have questions for the speaker, she's graciously agreed to respond, and I would encourage you to commit these through the Q&A. The chat is disabled. And I would now like to invite Nora to begin our presentation today.
Thank you very much, Tracy, for that kind introduction. And thank you, Save Venice, for inviting me to speak to you today, as always. Now, my talk, as mentioned by Tracy, is inspired by two main sort of occurrences or interests in my research. One is much longer standing, which is the Napoleonic kind of interval in Venetian history, which actually is more of an interval because so many things kind of end and irrevocably change. And ever since then, I've also been interested to think about this this paradigm shift, really. What was there before and what was there afterwards? Because I think it's almost impossible for us really to imagine and to put ourselves into the shoes of Venetians who lived during the time of the Venetian Republic. Now, and the second one of these is a talk I did pretty much a year ago. I think it was St. Patrick's Day last year, so a bit more than a year ago, on the Church of San Marziale, where, as Tracy has mentioned, there are several Save Venice restoration projects that have been taking place in recent years and that are currently underway. For example, of course, Tintoretto's painting of San Marziale, which was at the Tintoretto exhibition at the Palazzo Ducale in 2018, but also, of course, the Giulia Lama paintings that Tracy was just speaking about as well. And one of these Virgin Marys that I would like to speak to you today. And this interest, which, yes, was kind of triggered even more by San Marziale, links to this end of much of the kind of popular piety and civic rituals that informed so much of Venetian history and Venetian culture, and also Venetian society until Napoleon came along. Now, why Venice and the Virgin Mary? As Tracy mentioned, the 25th of March, so in 2 days' time, is, of course, the Annunciation, 9 months before the birth of Christ on Christmas Day. And on this day in 421 AD, so 1601 years ago on Friday, Venice was supposedly founded. Now, this is the legend of the foundation of Venice, when the church of San Giacomo, the small church by the Rialto, by the kind of Erbaria square, just before crossing Rialto to the St. Mark's side, when that church was supposedly founded and the foundation stone laid by a delegation from nearby Padua that included the Bishop of Padua at the time, who apparently was sent to build a port for the city of Padua. Now, I'll get back to this, and of course, the foundation of Venice is something that has, and this foundation myth and legend is something that has been revised, especially in recent years, thanks also to archaeological work done on Torcello itself. But as said, we'll get back to this at the end of my lecture. Now, the 25th of March, 421, and here you see the Annunciation by Titian in the Scuola Grande di San Marco, one of Save Venice's many restoration projects, which is currently, which is a current project as well. So, of course, here, the Virgin Mary being visited by the Archangel Gabriel, who announces the birth of Christ, ties Venice's destiny and, you know, Venice's birth, but also Venice's destiny very much to that of the Virgin Mary. And so I think this association between Venice and the Virgin herself is something that we can really trace throughout the 1,600 years of Venetian history. Now, about 1,300 years after the supposed foundation of Venice, the historian Flaminio Cornea, who wrote a very important treatise on the history of the Venetian churches, published a less famous book, which is where I took the first part of my title for today's lecture, Venice Favored by Mary, a report on the miraculous images of Mary kept in Venice. Now, this interest was, as I said, was sparked by one of these miraculous images, which is the one at San Marziale. Flaminio Conner was a historian who is much more remembered for other works of his. Now, this little book here, it's been derided often as being quite sort of a bit too sentimental and a bit too religious. In fact, there's sort of orations to the Virgin Mary at the end of each of the chapters. But I do think that it's actually a very precious and a very useful account of the kind of civic sort of piety and also that the Venetian people had towards the Virgin Mary and generally. So it gives us a kind of glimpse into their everyday devotions and into their everyday kind of religious practices, but also beliefs. And in fact, this relationship with the Virgin Mary, between the city of Venice and the Virgin Mary. Now, the Virgin Mary is also very interesting compared to other saints because there's obviously, it's not very clear whether she actually ever died or not. Now, we don't have any relics for the Virgin Mary, the way that, of course, in Venice, the Venetians are very proud to have the relics, for example, of the evangelist Saint Mark, but many, many other relics in the city. Of course, a saint needs to have died, and we need to have an account of their death in order to have their relics. And the Virgin Mary, now there's different tradition between the Eastern and the Western Church. In the Eastern Church, there's an account of the dormition of the Virgin Mary. So she falls asleep. It's not a proper death the way maybe other saints have died. In the Western tradition, it's more that she is assumed directly into heaven. And it's a bit ambiguous whether she actually dies before or not. Again, we'll get back to the assumption at the end of my lecture, where I've prepared a little conclusion and also a little conversation that Tracy and I are hoping to have at the end. So the Virgin Mary, because there's no relics of her, can be everywhere at once. And so she's very much venerated in many different places across the city of Venice, but of course across the whole medieval and early modern Christian world. In Venice herself, Flaminio Conner identifies 12 major cults to the Virgin Mary, cults to miraculous images of hers. Now, these miraculous images, and there's a lot of research that's been done by scholars like Robert Manura at Birkbeck College in London. There's a lot of also about kind of cognitive research, psychological research that's been done into miracles. That is very fascinating. And I think one of the most important points to consider is that, of course, whenever we speak of miraculous images, there's an interaction between the kind of devotee and the image herself, in this case of the Virgin Mary. And so there's always something that the kind of devote want from their saint. The saint is assumed to be in heaven, and of course, as Christians, the average Venetians petitioning these images are trying to emulate the saintly example of the Virgin Mary. Now you can see that these 12 images are spread quite widely across Venice herself. It's not the famous De Barbari map this time, but it's a Giovanni Merlo of 1696, that edition, which of course is very much inspired and based on De Barbari's 1500 map. And this is because you can see down here the Madonna della Salute, of course, hadn't been built when De Barbari made his bird's eye view, and the whole of this whole area, but also the Giudecca, are very, very different. So I thought it was more prudent to use this later example. On it, you can see that, of course, there's a little kind of cluster around the Rialto and San Marco area, but in fact, it stretches all the way to Santa Maria Maggiore over here, which is, I mean, nowadays you have Piazzale Roma and Tronchetto extending all the way here. This is Sant'Andrea, which is kind of at the beginning of Piazzale Roma as you drive into Venice. So the church was just, the church is just close to there. The earliest Mary to arrive was, of course, the Nicopaea in the Basilica of St. Mark. Very shortly after her, our very own San Marziale, Madonna of the Graces, arrived in Venice. And then some of the later ones are, I don't know why it keeps on jumping, I'm very sorry. Some of the later ones are the Salute I already mentioned, but also the another one in another Madonna that arrived after 1669 in the Church of the Celestia, right by the Arsenale. Now, these 12 Madonnas can be categorized, I think, in two main categories. If we look at their cults and we look at their origins themselves. One is possibly more political, and it's more about the kind of foreign politics of the Republic of Venice. And they're very much tied to the Stato da Mare, no? to the maritime empire that Venice had extending into the Eastern Mediterranean. And the second category is related to what I like to call miracles in the neighborhood. So local miracles that reflect very much the kind of local practices and worship practices, the local cults of, let's say, even ordinary Venetians, and are very often linked to monastic churches, but also neighborhood churches, parochial churches. And so there's a nice, already we can see that there's a sort of dichotomy here between these two different, but also dialogue between these two different origins and these two different categories of miraculous images of the Virgin. The first, however, is a slight exception, and I think it's a bit of a hybrid between the two. And this is the legendary arrival of the Madonna of the Graces at the Church of San Marziale, which was very recently restored by Save Venice, and whose altar, you see the two of the Giulia Lama evangelists that are currently being restored as well by Save Venice, just above here. But this altar still has a lot of current sponsorship opportunities, and we'll get back to that. The Save Venice staff will get back to you on that at the end of this, this lecture. Now, the Virgin herself arrived in Venice in 1268, so very early on. And there's several accounts of this legend written that have been published in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance period. And this is that this Virgin was, this Virgin or Mother and Child was sculpted by a shepherd outside of the town of Rimini. So just to the south of Venice, along the Adriatic coast. And the shepherd was inspired, his name was Rusticus, so that already implies a very kind of rural name. He was inspired by an angel to sculpt this figure of the Virgin Mary. This is another one. This is an oration that was published in the 16th century, which is at the Biblioteca of the Marciana in St. Mark's Square, which you can see at the end of the title there, which was formed by the angels by a hermit in the city of Rimini. So these very detailed descriptions, and you can also see that there's some similarities still between maybe the altar that's depicted here and the current one, which is of course the current one is later. So this is the altar which is attributed to Giovanni Comine and his workshop. You can see then the miraculous arrival, because how does the Virgin get to Venice from Rimini? Well, she's basically on a little boat. She's pulled by angels to the city of Venice. So again, there's this idea of destiny, and that this figure, this miraculous figure that was conceived by angels, is meant to be in the Venetian lagoon, which in a way is reminiscent of the apocryphal stories about Saint Mark, and his vision about one day being buried in the lagoon itself, which of course is taken then as the kind of, well, let's say, excuse to move his body from Alexandria in 828. Then once it arrives in Venice, there's a second panel. These are all, sorry, on the kind of predella, no, at the bottom of the altar. This one is the central one. And then on the left, we have this one, which is already a first miracle that the Virgin performs as soon as she gets to Venice, which is to heal a man and his mute son. And you can see how it's depicted right across of the bridge of San Marziale, which now which leads to the fundamenta of the Misericordia, now so to the other side of the church. And then this is the Godfather at the top of the altar, just showing you the pieces, the various elements of the altar, which Save Venice is hoping to restore in due course. Then these very beautiful figures of angels on either side framing the altar. And then, of course, also the salt deposits, which have caused the altar to decay quite a lot, and of course make this intervention even more, this intervention of a conservation even more urgent. And then finally, and this has already been generously sponsored, the Relief of Rusticus. You can see kind of the angel and then Rusticus carving out the Madonna out of a kind of tree trunk, as he's, we can imagine him kind of watching his sheep. As I said, he was a shepherd supposedly. So these are the origins of the Venetian Lady of Graces of San Marziale that arrived from the lower Adriatic. So it's not really local, but it's not really so far away as the Stato da Mar. So where many of these other Madonnas stem from, according to legend and according to tradition, but probably historically, as you will see, because they are mainly these ones, this category here, they are mainly Byzantine images. So it's obviously very easy to kind of assume that it is also historical fact that their provenance is in fact the kind of Eastern Venetian Empire. So here there's all kinds of links that could be made with Venetian historiography, but also with Venetian self-representation in the Renaissance, in the early modern period. Of course, the famous myth of Venice, Venice as a new Rome, especially after the fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 to the Ottomans. But also the gains and losses that Venice has throughout the kind of centuries leading to the fall of the Venetian Empire in 1797. How they fight constant wars with the Ottoman Empire, sometimes gaining and sometimes losing parts of this empire. But also in a way, I think it's interesting to consider within this kind of narrative of the myth of Venice, the fact that Venice, of course, here sees herself as a protector of the Christian faith and as a protector of this artistic patrimony left by the Byzantine, by the Eastern Roman Empire, which of course may, I mean, very early on, it falls prey even to a period of Byzantine iconoclasm, but then later, of course, becomes victim of the Ottoman and iconoclasm committed after Constantinople especially, but also other parts get conquered by the Ottoman Empire during their expansion. Now, I already mentioned her, and whenever you see these little kind of prints, these engravings, this is how the Madonnas are represented in the little treatise in the book by Flaminio Cornea that sort of inspired me to do this research together with, of course, San Marziale. Now, the Nicopaea, and I think it's very nice to start with her, especially because, as you can see, it's one of the very early projects of Save Venice in the late 1960s. It was restored by founding members of Save Venice. And the Nicopaea, of course, arrived in Venice with Doge Enrico Dandolo after the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when the Venetians themselves sack the city of Constantinople. And, you know, as I'm sure you're all aware, much of, especially the exterior decorations and embellishment of the Basilica of St. Mark's actually come from Constantinople herself. And this, again, of course, is a historical moment that I find very fascinating because, you know, we as lovers of Venice and of Venetian art might complain about what Napoleon did. And, you know, and we go to the Louvre and we see these Venetian paintings. But of course, you know, the Venetians did something very similar, if not exactly the same, you know, some 500-600 years before. So again, I think, you know, it's important to remember that, of course, you know, this idea of a new Rome is something that was taken up by Napoleon, just the same way that the Venetians had propagated themselves as the new Rome after the fall of Constantinople. Now, the Nicopaea is, of course, a Madonna of victory. She was apparently brought into battle on banners, you know, carried into battle by Byzantine emperors before she was moved to Venice in 1204. And she was a protectress of the city of Venice throughout her history, but she has a sort of mystical status because until 1677, when Doge Giovanni Bembo actually decided to move her into the chapel where we still find her today, just to the left of the main presbytery of St. Mark's, she was kept very much in secret, which kind of, I think, added to her status. So it's only been since 1677 that she's so easily accessible by Venetians and, of course, by us today. Then, after 1204, the second Madonna that arrived in Venice, again due to wars and series of iconoclasms in the Eastern Mediterranean, is this Virgin of Peace, which is to be found in Santi Giovanni e Paolo today, and it was actually in a oratory that the Dominicans had very close by. But then it was moved in a more public position in the 16th century. Now, what I find really interesting is that as I was doing some of this research, this Madonna was actually very much worshipped and appealed to during both world wars by Venetians. So I think, you know, this is the only account that I found of one of these cults really going into even, you know, very recent history into the 20th century, where we have Venetians appealing to her. Of course, yes, she's a Madonna of peace. So, you know, she's obviously during these two experiences of the two world wars, she must have been, you know, the Venetians must have somehow remembered the her kind of significance and her cult. Then moving on, this is the Church of the Celestia, which was Cistercian nuns, and it's another Madonna that arrived in Venice in the 14th century. So, you know, a bit about the century after the Nicopaea. Now, this again has a little interesting story because it was two Contarini brothers had sisters in the Celestia monastery, and they were traveling on business. They were traveling in the Eastern Mediterranean. And they encountered merchants from Pisa, apparently. So again, I thought it was interesting here to see this kind of rivalry possibly between Tuscan and Venetian merchants who were carrying this icon. And somehow, I don't know how, they convinced them to give them, I suppose, to sell them this icon. Very handily, two young men with ox carts were coming by and helped them move the icon to their ship. Now, when they returned to Venice, they were undecided whether they should put this icon into their parish church of Santi Apostoli, or whether it should be brought to and given to the monastery of their two sisters. Now, as they were considering this, their ship ended up in a terrible storm. And once they had decided in their hearts that it should go to their sisters at the Celestia, the storm abated. So again, this is one of the miracles attributed to this virgin image of the Virgin Mary. But again, there's this idea that she has a specific destiny, in this case being with the nuns of the Celestia. Similarly, when in 1569, this church is just next to the walls of the Arsenale, and there was a terrible explosion of gunpowder at the Arsenale, and the monastery and church almost completely burnt down. They wanted to move this Virgin Mary to safety in a different church. As they were carrying her away, apparently the icon, the image, became so heavy that it couldn't be moved anymore, and it couldn't even cross the first bridge. And so they realized that maybe it should stay at the Celestia, and they somehow, as they rebuilt the church in the late 16th century, they somehow built it, I suppose, around this image. Now, the Celestia is one of the churches that is suppressed by Napoleon, were one of the monasteries in 1810 with the general suppressions. But as many of you might know, close to the Arsenale, there still is today, and you can just read it there, the Campo della Celestia, and parts of the cloisters of the conventual building where these nuns lived still survives. Then another church that doesn't exist anymore is the Madonna delle Grazie, which is, it was one of those hospital islands between really Venice and the Lido, so close to San Salvador. There's a third island there. And again, it's a very interesting story. Apparently there was a hermit living there in the 13th century, and the monks of San Giorgio Maggiore let him live there. And then the hospitals were introduced for the pilgrims now coming to and from the Holy Land. And that must be how in the mid-15th century, this image of the Madonna arrived on the island itself. Later on, at one point, the order that then runs this hospital gets suppressed, and in the 17th century we have Capuchin nuns arriving, and apparently in several accounts, this church and this icon of the Madonna, people going again imploring for her graces, seems to have been a very popular place of pilgrimage. So far that, at the beginning of the 18th century, Albrizzi, in his, it's one of the guidebooks for foreigners visiting Venice, says that at the beginning of every month, people travel to this island to venerate the Madonna of the Graces. Now, this island is it's sort of dilapidated, as you can see. There was a hospital, a military hospital there, if I remember correctly. And then it's been in the newspapers quite a lot in recent years because it was sold, I think, to Stefanel and then to somebody else. So, and then of course there's this, always this fear that it might be turned into a sort of resort or into a hotel, this island. And then finally, the Madonna Autocasta, which is another Byzantine icon, that arrived in the Church of the Santi Roche and Margherita, which was where the Don Cigliotta, I don't know if anyone, but it's close to Campo Santo Stefano. There's this kind of, it's a religious institution, which now is a hostel, is a hotel. And there was a little church there, which belonged to Augustinian nuns. And again, they get suppressed in 1810. But their icon is moved to the Church of San Samuele. This icon, again, was in the Peloponnese, in the city of Misitra, which was also had the name of Sparta. It's one of those, like the Nicopoeia, was supposedly painted by Saint Luke. During an Ottoman invasion in the 1300s, it gets dispersed and lost. And then it's somehow found again. And it's interesting that we have a shepherd again, this time a girl, who finds it and protects it and brings it to the city of Nauplia, which was part of the kingdom, not kingdom, of course, the Venetian a province of the Morea, which was the Peloponnese. And then eventually, after another treaty with the Turks in 1541, Francesco Barbaro brings her to Venice. Now, the Church of San Samuele, of course, is very difficult to access it unless one goes to Biennale exhibitions. It's advertised on, and the icon is still there. I'm sorry, I didn't have a newer image of it, but yes, it's still advertised as a possible place for exhibitions on the Biennale website, on the Foundation website. Now, moving on to the other category, the miracles in the neighborhood. These are very different. They're much less exotic, but they much more, it's not kind of admirals and merchants and people bringing these images to Venice, but they're images who seem to originate in Venice and somehow are always linked to the kind of parishioners or the people living around the church where the image is housed. The first one is this image that was in the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore. Now this church it's the one that I mentioned earlier, which is on the very kind of eastern end of Venice. It's sort of part of the prison. There's a prison there. It's close to Piazzale Roma and it's empty, but as you can see, the church is still intact. It was Franciscan nuns who had their convent there. It was suppressed by Napoleon in the first wave in 1806. It then became a tobacco warehouse and has remained a warehouse and is inaccessible ever since. But apparently, all accounts say that it's an area that was sacred from the outset. And again, there was a little hermit, Pietro, who was living there. And he had several visions of the Madonna. Then there's a lady, Agnese and Caterina too, in fact, who live there, and they become sisters in the church. And then somehow a neighbor realizes that he's somehow in his house. Again, some of these accounts that are sort of curious, realizes that maybe the image of the Virgin that he somehow had was, what was causing all these miracles and all this worship and all this kind of special energy, I suppose, that the people felt in this neighborhood. Unfortunately, it was sold eventually in the 19th century after the Napoleonic suppressions. This church was completely spoiled, and it was basically everything was flogged off pretty much from the outset. Then another one, which is obviously maybe more famous, is the Madonna dell'Orto in Canareggio, which is a 14th century image that, again, there's legend here that Giovanni dei Santi or maybe Andriolo who sculpted this image, supposedly for Santa Maria Formosa, but it was rejected by the parish priest. And then it sort of ended up in this garden close to the church, dedicated to St. Christopher at the time. But then they started hearing all these noises and all these, miraculous things started happening. And then the parish priest of, well, it wasn't the parish at the time, but the prior of St. Christopher, as the church was dedicated then, ordered it to be moved into the church. And you can still see it there today. I think what's interesting is, of course, that we need to imagine, you can see it on the image of the corner, kind of print from the book, that obviously these statues, when they were statues, but even the icons themselves were very much dressed and decorated. No, they had, as you can see, she has a crown, they had jewelry, they had clothing. So they were very richly ordained and embellished, which is something that we find it very difficult. It's a bit like, the ancient Roman and ancient Greek temples and statues that used to be painted and very colorful, but we don't, we find it very difficult to really imagine that. Then the Church of Santa Maria dei Miracoli, I think this is quite sort of obvious, as the name of the church says. Obviously one of a kind of Renaissance jewel built by Pietro Lombardo in the 1480s. Entirely restored by Save Venice in the, well, let's say 1990s. And here there was a family, the Amadi family, who lived in this area. And in 1408, there was one of them had this Virgin painted onto a pillar outside his house. And again, also in this case, she started performing various miracles. And I think the grandson of the first Amadi decided to have a church built, and they collect something like 300,000 ducats, so an incredible amount of money, to commission Pietro Lombardo to build this absolutely beautiful and stunning church surrounding this image. Okay, then Santa Maria della Fava links to the Miracoli because it's the Amadi family again. I'm still trying to figure out whether it's a different branch of the family or the same family. I mean, they're both relatively close to each other, just, you know, in the area between kind of Santa Maria Formosa and Santi Giovanni e Paolo in kind of Canareggio Castello. Here you can see from De Barbari this time, a church which was much closer to the canal and this bridge. And again, there was on a pillar, so the Amadi family, they had, I don't know, they like these almost like tabernacles on the street, no? This image of the Virgin Mary that again, in the late 1400s, started performing miracles, and it was decided that it should be moved from, you know, this image should be moved and a church erected in its place. Now the name de la Fava, there's, you know, there maybe was a sort of a pastry shop close to it that sold the little, you know, the little fava, those little sort of sweets. But there's other theories as well about the origin of the church. And of course, I mean, yeah, this is a photo which I was very grateful from because there's a small hotel here and it was on TripAdvisor where you can see the bridge and obviously how the square is very much changed. And the church, I think in the 17th century, it was given to the Oratarians of St. Philip Neri, and the church was rebuilt. I think the last one is in the yes, in the late 1700s. Of course, you can see it wasn't fully completed. There's again in many of the reconstructions of these churches, of course, there's also disagreements. They run out of money and these sorts of things. Now, before I run out of time, because yeah, I wanted to give you an overview, so I'll move on to the popular piety and civic rituals. Now, I think speaking about many of these origins of these churches, there was already quite a lot of references to kind of popular piety and how maybe cults surrounding these images originated and how people would continue venerating and worshiping these images of the Virgin Mary. Now, what I find curious, of course, we all know Edward Muir's excellent study on the civic rituals in Renaissance Venice. And what I find curious is that none of these, except for two, are actually destinations for andate of the Doge. No? The andate were when the Doge, several times a year in the liturgical calendar would proceed, with the whole signoria and all the scuole grandi members to various churches. They would normally start in St. Mark's, go to a church, hear another mass and go back. And none of these virgins seem to have made it to the kind of higher echelons, let's say, of Venetian society and politics in terms of their cult. So I think that is something that needs to be considered. And the Nicopaea, like I said, was a very strong presence in St. Mark's, even if until the late 1600s, the people of Venice, and of course not everyone could just very easily go into St. Mark's, that also needs to be noted because it was the ducal chapel, but it wasn't easily kind of accessible for the people and even for the kind of patricians of Venice to see the Nicopaea. But I think in the Basilica of St. Mark's, we can definitely say that there always was, until the 1834, there was a strong presence of the Virgin, because you can see it kind of here in this print by Zatta, from his treatise on the Church of St. Mark's. You can see that just above in this ciborio of the, that's of course the Pala d'Oro, the golden screen in St. Mark's. Just above it, there's a sculptural group of an Annunciation. And I'm just going to move forward. Again, I found out again this, so we see all the wonderful and important things that Save Venice has done and continues doing, because also this, serendipity would have it, was restored by Save Venice in 2000. Now it's now in the little museum, now where also the original horses of St. Mark's are, in the Basilica. This very beautiful sculptural group from the early 1300s. Interestingly, the angel has, it's a very, very rare example of the angel with this kind of these metal wings that have been gilt. And I'm just going to go forward to this image where you can obviously see the Pala d'Oro. So you have, St. Mark's, the relics of St. Mark's that are obviously below the Pala d'Oro. The Pala d'Oro that somehow thankfully survived kind of Napoleon's, the French troops' rape, really, of the treasury of St. Mark in 1797. And above it, it used to be crowned by this Annunciation, as you can see in the detail of the print to the right. So I think this is just something that we, interesting and I think important to stress. And this is only an example of Francesco Morozzini, who was often considered one of the last heroes of the Venetian Republic, who receives his honors to be an admiral of the Venetian fleet in the late 1600s. The painting probably is from about 1699. I think it's the 1680s this takes place, where you see the presbytery of St. Mark's. And unfortunately, we don't see the Annunciation, but of course, in front of, just the importance of this ritual space and the Annunciation kind of, overlooking these kind of rituals. And of course, the whole of the Signoria. This is after the revamping of the 16th century of St. Mark's, where, the choirs, there was the retro choir, which was for the canons of St. Mark's, and then there was the areas reserved for the Doge and the Signoria. And all of this, of course, at this point, the Nicopea is, of course, on display. So just towards us, I would say, from this view. And then finally, two more images which relate to the Stato da Mare, so to the Venetian Empire, which I didn't mention before because I think they get possibly involved in the kind of rituals of the Republic and of the government itself. This is it's now in the Diocesan Museum of the Patriarchate and of the Patriarchate of Venice. It used to be in the Church of Santa Giustina, which is very, very close to San Francesco della Vigna. You'll see a photo in a moment. It's now a high school, a scientific high school. And it's probably Spanish. The legend goes that when the Moors, so again, the kind of evil, of course, in all this, there's this narrative where, of course, there's this constant struggle between Venice and the evil kind of Ottomans and Muslims, I suppose. When they conquer Spain, the angels fly this image to the New Rome, so to Constantinople. And then, of course, in Constantinople, it ends up being... Constantinople itself ends up being conquered in 1453. And then again, it's flown by angels. This is reminiscent very much of Loreto. And again, it's interesting, no? The Virgin Mary, that we don't have a kind of physical presence of her relics on earth. And so it's angels that fly these miraculous images around, also the San Marziale one. It's then brought to Santa Giustina. And again, you saw it on the previous slide, Save Venice also restored this one. It ended up in San Francesco della Vigna, as I said, very close by to Santa Giustina after the church was suppressed by Napoleon. And it was horribly painted. And you can see on the right, the way it's huge, it's life-size, the way it looked, nobody basically paid any attention to it. And then thankfully it was rediscovered and it was cleaned, and we see some of the remains of the polychromatic, this was often done, that it was overpainted, but when the original paint didn't look so great. But obviously we are more purists nowadays. And so you can see the way it looks now. And then Santa Giustina, now you can see the high school, of course, a very important church after 1571. So after the Battle of Lepanto, which obviously took place on the 7th of October, the day of Santa Giustina. And so from then onwards, the Doge would arrive once a year on the 7th of October. There was an andata, there was a procession to Santa Giustina. And I haven't found proper accounts yet, but I think it would be interesting to find out the relationship with this Madonna, which arrives 100 years later in 1669 after Venice loses Crete, which of course is a huge kind of moment, a terrible moment, because losing Crete in kind of, you know, the famous idea of the decline of Venice, which isn't particularly true, but yes. And then finally, of course, the Salute, and I don't think the Salute really needs a lot of introductions. Again, after the plague in 1631, as you know, Baldassare Longhena, they built a church, and then very fortuitously, also this Madonna arrives in Venice. And obviously since then, every year since you know, since there's the Salute Festival, which is the other one, obviously instance where we still see great kind of popular piety, and where in the last kind of, you know, just over a century of the Venetian Republic, it was one of the places that the Doge went to on his andate. Okay, I think I would leave it here now, and I would like to invite Tracy maybe to have this little conversation about Venice and the Virgin Mary, as we had sort of planned before I
Thank you again for this really fascinating talk, and I think to take up the sort of subject of the slide that you have here, one of the questions that was submitted in advance is really a good lead-in, which is, what do you think is the most beautiful painting of Mary in Venice? And why was Mary chosen for so many paintings in the city? Well, I think you've gone a long way towards answering the latter part, but not the first. So
well, I think
what would you say?
The first one, and you know, yes, I mean, this is, it's not as spontaneous as it might seem, but of course, I think the Titian's Assunta is, of course, well, I think to all of us, obviously dear to our heart as kind of Save Venice members, and in the Frari, currently, of course, in 2012, there was a first campaign, and currently it's being restored again by Giulio Bono. And I think really the assumption of the Virgin, because also the subject matter, and, you know, Titian painting at the last big panel, oil on wood painting, well, it's 3 panels in the Venetian Renaissance, I think definitely deserves its kind of special place in Venetian art. And I think we can see, you know, really well this, you know, this idea of the Virgin being assumed into heaven, which is, of course, sets her, I mean, she's for several reasons, of course, in Christian kind of theology, she is set apart. But of course, this ambiguity about her death and this kind of assumption into heaven, and the 15th of August, I think, yeah, I think she, yeah, I don't think there's too much you need to say about the Assunta, to be honest. I don't know what you think, but.
Well, I think there's always directions one can go with it. And certainly appreciate everyone who's become such an expert in Titian's techniques, which he's bringing to his work on this very, very important painting, important and beautiful. So thank you for those thoughts. There is a question that's related to your discussion of the 12 Maries. And it is from someone taking their students to Venice this summer, for which Mary is one of the themes that they'll be following up. And can you provide a source for a good list or reading of the 12 locations where you can find the examples that you discussed?
Well, I think the Flaminio Cornea, the book that's Venice Favored by Mary, the one that I had on a slide at the beginning, I think that's a good place. But of course, not the current locations, they're not all 12 of them are still in those locations. And some, I mean, you saw that for some of them, I don't actually have the images because they appear to have been lost, or I haven't been able to trace them. Apart from that primary source, off the top of my head, I'm not sure, because there doesn't seem to be much that's written about them.
Probably you can read about the processions and so forth in Ed Muir's book.
Yeah.
I think that would be maybe a place to go. The book on ritual.
Well, this links, I mean, Ed Muir, and what I find very fascinating.
And another person with a question that is, what is the name of the hotel that you can see on the steps near Santa Maria della Consolazione?
That's it's the hotel, I think, alla Fava. It's just called alla Fava or della Fava maybe. But yeah, it's very easy to
find. So in terms of a kind of question about where the sort of location of this event of Mary's Assumption and trying to compare that with the Eastern tradition. Do you find that there are different roles for angels in regards to the Madonna? Are they a kind of just supporting cast, or do you find other kinds of angels specifically named?
Well, there's the Archangel Gabriel in the Annunciation.
Mm-hmm.
I think often they are, I think with angels, it's one of those things, no, because angels are not human, that they never were human, whereas saints, of course, the Virgin Mary in Primus, but all saints and Jesus have shared the experience of being human, and angels are a bit apart. So I think in many ways they accompany her because she has this obviously special position as the Mother of God, and this assumption, and we're not sure whether maybe she never died and she was directly assumed into heaven, and so I think it seems right that maybe she has a sort of special relationship with these kind of celestial beings that obviously are very mysterious, that we're not really sure how they could be defined.
Another question that we have is someone who is interested in the all of the Byzantine images and icons. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the plague connection. You mentioned that in relationship to the Salute, but how were the Madonnas actually, if I can use, used during times of plague? And you mentioned the andate, the doges, so they were visited. Role that these Marian icons might take.
I'm very sorry, Tracy, but you skipped for a moment there. I couldn't hear the whole question.
What would you say the active role is of these icons as a object that are considered to participants in helping to avert plague, for example?
Well, I think, of course, in the case of the Salute, it seems it's very obvious. Although what I find very interesting is that connection, that kind of political connection that the Salute seems to have, especially in its origin, where Crete or Candia falls to the Ottomans, the Venetians lose it, and very strangely, at exactly the same time, this icon arrives in Venice, and they're building a church for the end of the plague, and I find that very it's definitely coincidence, but what I found really interesting, and like I said, it's a very recent sort of project still of mine. So there's many things that I still want to explore. But what I find very interesting is how with many of these icons, there seems to be this kind of political connection that goes beyond maybe a kind of local sort of function in a way, because there seems to be these, sorry.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking of the fact that, for example, a Madonna Nicopea was paraded, and it's that idea of sight, as in SIGHT, that you mentioned. There's a kind of restriction as to when some of these were visible. So devotion was really very intense at the times when they were visible, and sometimes even brought out of their protective, ambiance and out into the public, in order that the sort of charisma of the object could communicate itself. So I think in terms of some of these other questions, the one about the Madonna Ortocasta at San Samuele, I can answer that. The church is, like many deconsecrated churches, a site that is often used for the Biennale as external to the Biennale grounds. So it is actually at San Samuele, right by the Palazzo Grassi. And I think some of the other questions, Save Venice can provide a direct link to that information. And another question I think is important is to make a connection to what you said first, perhaps, about how this relates to your current research on Napoleon and the dissolution of the churches and monasteries, and how the kind of research that you're doing helps us to learn more about these kinds of objects.
Well, yes, my research, it's been quite I think it's been 13 years now that I've been working on Napoleon in Venice from a kind of historical and art historical approach and perspective. So this moment, this kind of historical moment, as I said also in the beginning, where so much of what was there in Venice before gets interrupted, and of course this whole kind of moment of the French Revolution and of Napoleon that the whole of Europe experiences. But then at the same time, there's this other approach, which is, of course, these churches that get, dozens and dozens of churches, first the religious orders, but then also, I think it's between 700 and 900 scuole piccole. And of course, some were in churches themselves, others were in separate buildings. And then the parish churches, the fact that they reduced the parishes of Venice from 70 first to 40 and then to 30 parishes. And so it's, what I've been finding is that there's, of course, there's all these logistics and this administration behind it. The kind of inventories are drawn up as it's closed, as a place is closed. They then need to decide, okay, which are the best of these paintings, and those paintings go into, maybe go into museums or into palaces, into the Accademia, which obviously opens in 1817, the galleries at least, the school is already around before. But then there's, these hundreds and hundreds of paintings that, canvases that just sort of perish because they end up in warehouses. I don't know, the Scuola Grande of San Giovanni Evangelista becomes a warehouse. And there's one account of 200 paintings basically being destroyed, basically being ready to completely lost, essentially, because of humidity and because of rain coming in through the roof. And so it's something that's very kind of difficult really to completely kind of get an overview of. But then, of course, if we think of the icons, and many of the, especially the Byzantine, the Eastern icons, of course, are made of very precious materials as well. And so there's the whole other part, which is, paintings, but then there's the many icons and liturgical kind of objects that essentially get melted down, or they get sent to the government in Milan, or even all the way to Paris. And that's what happens in 1797. So not even during Napoleon, but during the kind of revolutionary moment, with so many bits in the treasury of St. Mark. And so, and then there's the third aspect of much of the furniture, but also altars and sculptures that end up being sold. And the kind of Venetian mainland is full of architectural elements, organs as well, furniture. Very few paintings, but especially architectural elements and sculpture and furniture that would, in these villages that maybe were built and expanded during the 19th century, and so needed parish churches, and their priests or the fabbricieri would go to Venice and go on a shopping spree, essentially. But then, of course, all of that can be to things that were going on in Venice before even, which is what this project is a bit about.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Nora. I think there's so many Save Venice restorations of Mary, because they're, in fact, you've pointed out the really special relationship that Venice has with Mary. So thank you for also drawing attention to this glorious apsidal mosaic that is in the Basilica of Santa Maria Assunta at Torcello, part of our 50th anniversary campaign, and really a splendid example of the very early devotion that the city had in this iconic location. So I believe the office has some slides to share as well.
Yeah, I think they were coming in. Yes, these ones, yeah.
So let me thank you, and also all of the Save Venice members for attending this wonderful presentation today. And as Nora pointed out, Save Venice has undertaken a number of projects in the Church of San Marziale. Here is the altar that we saw of the Madonna and Child that was discussed in Nora's talk. The Madonna and Child has been restored, and incredible color and original material that was revealed through the process is part of what is so exciting, I think, about these projects. And the altar, as we saw in Nora's slides, is suffering from the kind of serious condition problems that besets so many of the marble works in Venice, soaking up the water from below, and the damp creates this kind of crystallization of salt deposits. And this then, as you saw, degrades the surface of what is really lovely carved decoration that includes the narrative of this wonderful altar. If we could have the next slide. There are the three main reliefs, of which one has generously been sponsored by Alice Friedman and Cameron Mason. But the other two reliefs are in need of adoption. One of them, the marble altar front itself, depicts this miraculous arrival of the Madonna by boat, which I just love the Venetian twist. Usually with the Madonna, she's flying in with her house held up by angels, as Nora mentioned, the function of angels. And of course, in Venice, she arrives by boat, and thereby becomes an important focus of devotion in the Church of San Marziale. And the miracle on the bridge, as you can see, again, a wonderful sculpture. And in addition, there are all of the other sculptural elements, which include a number of the marble angels and so forth that are part of the structure that begin at $3,500. And so if you're interested in participating further with Save Venice, contact the New York office. And thank you again for coming to join us with the virtual presentation today. And our next virtual member event will be held on April 27th. Its title is What Harm a Wind Too Great Might Do at Sea, Shakespeare's Venice in Times of Crisis. And it will be presented by Dr. Shal Bassi. In the meantime, hope you all are well, and we look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you again, Nora.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.